Thank you so much, Dr. McEachern and Dean Everett, for your kind words and opening remarks. I'm going to introduce Dr. Scruggs, who will be our moderator for the day. But before I do that, I just want to make sure that we are clear about who our honorees are for this colloquium, so who we are celebrating. So our Lifetime Achievement Award winners will be Adric Howlands, Dawood Bey, and Fred Wilson. Kensasha Holman Conwell, who is here with us today, will also get the Humanitarian Award. Dr. Kelly Jones will receive the James A. Porter Book Award. And a nice surprise will be that we actually will be giving a Founders Award to Dr. Coleman as well. So he's also one of our honorees for this colloquium. So let's make sure that we celebrate those individuals, send them, come up to them, give them our warm wishes, and celebrate them as we should. So Dr. Scruggs. Delilah Scruggs earned a Ph.D. in art history in 2010 from Harvard University, where she focused on African American art and traditional West African art. Dr. Scruggs has held curatorial positions at the Williams College Museum of Art and at the Brooklyn Museum, and she has served as an educator at the Studio Museum in Harlem and at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. She recently returned to Brooklyn Museum, where she now serves as senior museum educator and fellowship coordinator. Straddling both curatorial and museum education, Delilah strives to serve as a bridge between art collections and everyday people, and as a translator, making scholarly ideas accessible to general audiences. Aside from her museum duties, Dr. Scruggs is currently working on an article on a little-known sculpture by Elizabeth Catlett entitled Mask for the Whites. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Scruggs.
Good morning. It's my honor to be here in the presence of such amazing scholars. Again, I'd like to repeat my thanks to the Planning Committee and especially Dr. Melanie Harvey. As the moderator today, it's my responsibility to move things along at a timely pace, and so I'm just going to get directly into it by introducing our opening lecture speaker, Dr. Bridget Cooks. Dr. Bridget Cooks is Associate Professor of the Department of Art History and the Chair of the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Irvine. Her scholarship addresses representations of African Americans in visual culture, the history of African American artists, and museum criticism. She has worked in museum education at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., the Oakland Museum, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And she is the author of an amazing book, Exhibiting Blackness, African Americans and the American Art Museum, published in 2011. Some of her recent publications can be found in American Quarterly, American Studies, and the International Journal of Media and Cultural Politics. She is currently working on and completing her next book, A Dream Deferred, Art of the Civil Rights Movement and the Limits of Liberalism. Today, Dr. Cooks will be delivering a lecture entitled The Everlasting Now. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bridget Cooks.
Yeah, I think that's fine. So good morning, everyone. I want to thank also Dr. Melanie Harvey and, of course, Dr. Coleman, and Dr. Harvey in particular for inviting me to give the opening lecture. I always enjoy attending this colloquium when I'm able to come, and I'd like to thank you all for your time and for the great distance that many of you have come to be here. I've been looking forward to this event for a while. So when Melanie invited me to contribute to this event, it was shortly after the musical icon Prince had died. And like most fans, I was shocked and saddened by the news. It came as such a surprise and marked another loss in a year marked by social upheaval and incredible deficits of public figures. Prince's premature death and the subsequent news that he did not leave a will created much speculation over what exactly would happen to his musical empire his unpublished music, and his mysterious home/recording studio, Paisley Park, located in the Minneapolis suburb of Chanhassen, Minnesota. Considering the theme of this year's Porter Colloquium, interventions, ruptures, and affirmations, archival engagements in the art of the African diaspora, at the same time that I was thinking about Prince's death, I thought about the ways in which our lives leave an archive, a record of what we have done, where we were, what we thought, how we engaged with the histories that we've inherited, and also how we engaged with the world around us. So I took the title of one of Prince's songs for today's talk, The Everlasting Now, to help me think through the topic of this year's colloquium and frame the situation in which we find ourselves as artists, art historians, art librarians, conservators, archivists, patrons, collectors, and enthusiasts who focus on the art of Black people. The state of Prince's affairs when he passed last April created an archival moment. And this image that I'm showing you in the background, this is Paisley Park. It seems like such a sterile place. It kind of looks like the Getty. But this is where Prince had his creative genius, right, where he lived and made his art. So today, nearly a year after Prince's death, Paisley Park is now an archive. And there are different experiences you can have in Paisley Park depending on how much you can afford to pay. And this quick transition from home to museum brings to bear the title of my talk, The Everlasting Now. Now is the archive of tomorrow. What we do today becomes content for the archive of our future. So considering the question of the archive in the discourse of African American art, I ask myself, and we ask ourselves, a set of questions that I want to try to address this morning. How do Black artists archive our presence in this world? How do Black artists archive our critical repositionings about our place in history? In the hands of Black artists, how do the archives, the records of our personal and collective pasts, allow us to reconceptualize the present? How do Black artists create an archive of feeling that manifests and marks the condition of our lives? How do Black artists recreate the archive? So indeed today, we've come to a new level of federal and international recognition in the lives of Black people. However, at the same time, we are forced to resist the violence of anti-Black sentiment, politics, and institutions in our everyday lives. We experience the paradox of Black life and death simultaneously. We witness the spectacular ritual of brutal anti-Black violence demonstrated in the murders of Yvette Smith, Michael Brown, Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, and many others, at the same time that we witness instances of Black triumph through accomplishments by Misty Copeland, Loretta Lynch, Serena Williams, Bree Newsome, and many others. This current political moment of Black death, frustration, and survival encourages us to look to the past for models through which we can respond. This is just another photograph of Prince in his Paisley Park empire. And this has been something that has been a tradition for visual artists, looking back to the past to see where we've been and where we're going. And today I just want to look at a handful of examples of the many African American artists who have taken our history and represented it to us in ways that inspire and move us. So let me be the first of several people we will hear from this weekend to talk about Fred Wilson. For many of us, he is the first artist who comes to mind when we think of artists who use archival materials in their work. And I'm showing you here one of the vitrines from his 1992 work, Mining the Museum, that was at the Maryland Historical Society. Mining the Museum was a collaboration between the Historical Society and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Baltimore. And Wilson conducted extensive research at the Society, working with museum staff, docents, and members of the public to reinstall the collection in their space. So he did not create any new artworks in the traditional sense of an artist creating a sculpture or a painting, but he rearranged the archival display at the Society to produce provocative and innovative ways to understand Maryland's and indeed America's history. The vitrine that I'm showing you was labeled Metalwork, 1793 to 1793 to 1880, featuring a silver tea set made in Maryland along with slave shackles, also made in Maryland during the same period. Both the tea set and the shackles belonged in the museum's collections, but the shackles had never been shown before. I'll show you some other examples of this installation. Some of us are familiar with this project and others of us aren't. And I have to say, I think that Mining the Museum has left such a tremendous impact and legacy, particularly on students and art historians and in museum studies. But I have a graduate student who's writing a dissertation right now, and there's no record of mining the museum at the Maryland Historical Society. There are no archives there that recognize the show, and she couldn't find anyone on staff who knew anything about the show. So it's worth talking about this show again, because even though for some of us it was very impactful and left a big impression, the museum as an institution can sort of heal itself from its ruptures. And so it's something that we have to sort of work on consistently and be persistent in the kinds of changes that we'd like to see, particularly in the representation of African American people in our history. This is the room of whipping post and chairs, and here we see federal period chairs, examples of the decorative arts, along with a slave whipping post, arranged so that we see the difference in power and position and spectatorship of the slave by the merchant and ruling classes. And throughout his career, Fred Wilson has produced meaning in profound ways through his visions of positionings and proximities. Here's a detail, and I'll show you this image here from a different artwork altogether. This is an archival photograph, 5 generations on Smith's Plantation, Beaufort, South Carolina, taken by Timothy O'Sullivan in 1862, juxtaposed with a gathering of Black Americana figures, mimicking the same multi-generational structure that we see in O'Sullivan's photograph. And so I think with Wilson's work here, it asks, how do these two representations of Black people, one real and one fictional, speak of Black realities in American history? And this is something that Wilson does very well without being so didactic that he's sort of hitting us over the head with a message. Another example, this is from 1991, called Addiction Display. In this work, he was addressing the kind of addiction that the West has to Central and Latin American production. So in the vitrine, we have pre-Columbian artifacts, copies of pre-Columbian artifacts that are also laid out with cocaine paraphernalia. So he's making this comparison between these two sort of objects of value for the West in terms of the way that our museums and corporations have treated Latin and Central America as valuable. On the wall, we see 6 different African masks that are blinded and silenced by flags of colonizing powers of the United Kingdom and France. And one more example from Wilson. This is an installation shot from a project that he did at SCAD, the Savannah College of Art and Design, in 2012. He worked with the incredible Walter O. Evans collection of African American art and documents, and here he installed objects from the collection throughout the museum space there. He also used Savannah gray brick, a brick traditionally created in Savannah and used throughout historic buildings in the city. And he used these bricks in his exhibition to try to make a connection between the past and the present. On the right side in this slide, you can see a mantle created by Thomas Day. And then where the hearth is Aaron Douglas's cover for Fire from 1926. And so it's another example of, beyond mining the museum, how he puts these installations together to juxtapose different kinds of histories and images. I'm going back and forth between the East Coast and the West Coast. So here's Betty Saar in LA, and I have to show her iconic image from 1972, The Liberation of Aunt Jemima. This is another example of using archives, a kind of archive of Black Americana, she is the godmother of the ready-made as far as I'm concerned, and the way in which she puts objects together to produce new meanings. So we have this notepad holder in the middle, this Andy Warhol type reproduction of prints with this mirrors on the side with this kind of infinitum kind of presentation of how many Aunt Jemimas are there, thinking about the reproduction of her image, but then the inclusion of the rifle and the pistol in her hand. So doing something with the image that makes us think about the archival image in a different way. Some more recent work from her. This is The Weight of Whiteness. This was just in an exhibition in her gallery in Los Angeles. And this is another example of Sar's carefully constructed assemblages that often address great concerns that persist through the ages: the mystery of time, the quest for freedom, the trap of imprisonment, and the violent ambition of greed. And certainly slavery comes into this last category. I wanted to just say a few things about the objects that she uses for The Weight of Whiteness. So she has this utility scale for the base of the artwork that allows her to play with whiteness as something that can be measured. Used for race and class-based divisions from the 17th century through much of the 20th century, the racial mix of one's ancestry could be used to determine one's social status and everyday mobility. And so here, Sar is bearing whiteness as a physical weight, right? Something that can be measured as well as a kind of genetic inheritance. I want to show you the back of this also. She has this doorstop of this ship, and the sails show the flag of England. She's also used this link of chain that kind of prevents whiteness from fully registering its weight on the scale. And even though she has this sort of angelic image of this putti, it looks very pockmarked and artificial. And so there's a way in which she really uses aging and the wear of objects to also help her tell a story. Standing in the Shadow of Love, another example of her brilliant uses of ready-made. So here we have this kind of diptych. On one side, this old-fashioned washing board, and then this window. And she has reproduced two different kinds of photographs on each surface. When we look on the left, we see this reproduction, this kind of photo transfer of these young Black children that look like they need some love and attention. On the right, she has a group portrait of Mammy with her charges. And so just seeing this sort of dark reproduction of this group portrait on the left on this object for cleaning things versus this kind of transparency of the white window on the other side is another way in which she's using archival objects, but also, I think, bringing in her own commentary so that we see these photographs of mammies and the photographs of Black ancestors in a way that's very different, right? So she frames them in such a way that her commentary becomes part of the archive. I also want to show Rene Stout, a local artist with international fame. She just takes the most brilliant portraits of herself that I think about these as being works of art. Trained as a photorealist, but someone who cannot be limited to any one type of artwork. I have to give you some classic Rene Stout. This is Fetish number 2 from 1988. This is a work that seems to be timeless in the way that there's a kind of bravery in making a plaster cast of her body, presenting a very intimate representation of her body in relationship to her African past. So medical healing bags of the Minkisi on the plaster cast of her body we see on her torso and her breasts, and in her belly a glass door with a stamp from Niger, an image of a baby inside, and flowers. And so I think this is a work that really has resonated for many years with African American women in particular, but not only, because of the way that she's tapping into a sort of African ancestral past and also a feminine past and future. Just show you a couple of more images from her where she's bringing together labels from contemporary products and mixing them with kind of archival diagrams. Sanctuary for the Dead. This leads me right into our next artist, Radcliffe Bailey. And when my sister Linda and I were at the African American Museum of History and Culture yesterday, it was great to see her in the same room with Radcliffe Bailey, because both of them use photographs, archival photographs, but create these kind of worlds around them in very generous ways. That, you know, even though we don't know who this man is, we get a feeling for who he is, and he might remind us of people in our own archives. En route is something that is one of these works that does exactly this. Starts with a photograph or multiple photographs, and then what Bailey does, which is so amazing to me, is uses all kinds of different techniques to create layers, right? The way that he paints on the glass or attaches paper or different kinds of images on the glass that immediately, physically, you get a sense of depth that translates as a metaphor into the content of the material that he's showing. This is from 2005. Another example, this is Destination Unknown. Again, we see that layering, starting with the physical object that represents the slave ship, and this takes us back to the slave ship that we saw in the back of Betty Saar's work. Here we also get ironwork from the Low Country at the base of the ship, and then this kind of cyanotype blue reproduction of men and women working the fields below that. It's a kind of, think about that, it's a kind of like Drexia underwater location of the Africans who refused to be made into slaves, who committed suicide during the Middle Passage. Another wonderful example, 4 in One Corner North, again, starting with an image. And you know, when he was graduating from college, his grandmother gave him over 400 photographs of their family, and he's still working through that personal archive. And one thing about Bailey's work that I find is important is he seems to be so generous. You know, so even though we're not part of his family, there are people in his artworks that I seem to feel a connection with, right? There's something very generous about being able to share the personal in this work. And again, another example of creating a world, a whole network of abstraction around the initial photograph. So we think that we really have a role in creating the meaning for this work of art. Who did he become? Where did he go? We get the suggestion of maps and networks of movement around the boy's face. And we get to use our imagination to kind of fill in the blanks there. One more example. It's hard to narrow it down with Bailey's work because there's so many fantastic pieces. Thinking about the archive, I needed to also mention Gee's Bend. I've done some research and writing on Gee's Bend, so I just picked one quilt. The work clothes quilts in the exhibitions of Gee's Bend were the ones that really sort of stayed with me the most. There was something about recycling this material, making something from nothing, right? I mean, this is the kind of essence of what that means. An object that is created for a different use, given a second life after their original function was over, when the clothes were worn out. And these work clothes quilts have inspired many people who saw the exhibitions of the Gee's Bend quilts to examine their own lives, to find values in their own personal archives that maybe they would have considered worthless. In a contemporary twist, I'd like to just mention Shanique Smith, and I like this connection between the Gee's Bend quilts and what Shanique Smith is doing. I think there's something really lovely about putting them side by side. Former graffiti artist from Baltimore, born and raised, former artist in residence at the Studio Museum, And you see that edge of her graffiti in her painting. She combines her skill to paint on walls with the discarding of clothes. She's particularly interested, I'll show you this work, in the clothes that some of us give away when we're done with them, right? How they're packed and how they're shipped to other countries where they're desperately needed. And so she creates art through these bundles of old clothes, and then she focuses on the shapes and lines that she sees in these bundles, and she makes paintings from them, right? So you can see the kind of formal similarity between the painting in the back, No Key Question, and Soul Elsewhere. And this work I'm showing you just because I love it, a bundle of black clothes that reminds me of a sculpture by Louise Nevelson. And at the same time, she's making this art historical reference, but suggesting the state of blackness is something that's been worn and devalued in this country. Theaster Gates, who I think is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is he the third African-American artist to have a solo show at the National Gallery of Art? I think that's right. Okay, we'll go with that. It's Bearden, it's Carrie James Marshall, and it's Theaster. Okay, so this show is up now. It just opened last month. Allie Peel, who's here from the gallery, has reminded me that I need to get over there. But another example in thinking about the archive, Theaster, who works in a variety of media, this kind of contemporary Renaissance man, I think he's really pricked viewers with the poignancy of his reuse of retired fire department water hoses. So in this work, Civil Tapestry, we see the lengths of these water hoses lined up to create really a minimalist work in terms of form, but work that's also full of content, racially loaded and historically referential, thinking about the civil rights movement and the way in which the power of water through fire hoses were used to punish African Americans standing up for their rights. Another example, Flag, from 2007, a kind of abstraction of national flag, American, British, or French flag. I think it lends itself to multiple colonial powers, and thinking about the unfulfilled and betrayed promises of civil rights and racial equality. How am I doing on time? I know we started a little late. I'm doing okay. Going back to the West Coast, we've enjoyed Noah Purifoy's art for decades, and in the last few years, through the efforts of curators Franklin Sermons, Yael Lupschutz, and Joe Lewis, we were able to see a retrospective exhibition of Purifoy's work at LACMA. And the exhibition also traveled to the Wexner Center in Ohio last year, and a catalog was produced. Don't sleep on this catalog. Don't sleep on Noah Purifoy. If you haven't become familiar with his work, you really should. It's really wonderful, and I invite you personally to go to Joshua Tree to look at his 8-acre outdoor museum of sculpture that he made from discarded materials. This is a space that's open, that's free to the public. There's no fence around it. You just need to know exactly how to get there, because you can get lost. You really are getting there on desert roads that are unpaved and don't have names, and it's worth it. It's really wonderful to go out there. Noah is known for his, I'll go back to this image, his use of archival material through his exhibition 66 Signs of Neon, in which he created art from the actual melted ruins from the Watts riots in 1965. His exhibition 66 Signs of Neon was exactly what it sounds like, an exhibition of sculptures made from 66 neon signs that were twisted and disfigured from the heat of the riot fires. The exhibition was a group show that included others who were in his artistic community. And his engagement with the archive was in the collection of objects from racial trauma and destruction, right? He's someone else who created something from nothing. He lived in Joshua Tree on this land, and he died there. He started the Watts Tower Art Center, which still exists, and near the end of his life, he decided that he wanted to get away from people, and he needed some space to do the work that he thought he was really born to do. So we have these archival materials, but we're also seeing an archive of the way in which he thought critically about the objects as he put them together to make art. So in this example, this is called segregation, black and white water fountain. So the white fountain on the left provides refrigerated, cool water, and the fountain on the right, that's for blacks, is a toilet. Right? So through his use of objects, he archived a feeling of racism in America, and he created an index of objects through his commentary on the practice of racial discrimination. Purifoy is someone else that cannot be pigeonholed. He, in LA we talk about junk art, so he was a junk artist, but he also could really show off his artistic training. He started off as a furniture designer and interior designer, and I think it's particularly in the 60s, being a black male interior designer in Los Angeles was the equivalent of being a unicorn in some way. People just didn't know what to do with you. And so he went on to do all kinds of other projects. But here, this is a collection of metal trays that were donated to him from a hospital. And he's just showing off here his sense of elegance in form. He was a conceptual artist, and he was an abstract artist as well. Just another shot. You can't take a bad picture when you go to Noah's Outdoor Museum. And that is a Joshua tree. They really exist, people who haven't been to the desert. So at the beginning of my presentation, when I spoke about a new level of federal and public recognition, I was thinking of this amazing feat of the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. We have established a resource, an archive, a path for future goals, and I'm saying we, because I feel great ownership of it. I do not work there, but when my sister and I were there yesterday, we really were so excited and impressed by what was there. We were lucky enough to go for the first time yesterday, and what Lonnie Bunch and the curators were able to amass is just fantastic. When you talk about an archive of history, right, we really have to talk about featuring that museum. And I was part of the first group of staff at the museum in 1994, working with the late, great Claudine Brown and the amazing Deborah Willis when it was just an experiment in the Arts and Industries building. And it was called then the National African American Museum Project. And there was hesitancy by the government to create a National African American Museum because many didn't believe that there was enough material to supply content for a museum. And going to that museum, you could easily see it doubled and tripled in size, right? But there was this idea that black people all are poor, and we use things until we use them out. And we use them up altogether, and then there's nothing left. So it's really gratifying. I wish Claudine could see this museum today. I'm showing you just an interior. This was an early sort of schematic of the space, and this was an early idea for the way that the Emmett Till casket was going to be exhibited. And I was really happy to see the way that it's been exhibited in reality in a more still, sacred, and intimate space than what was originally thought here by the designers. The presentation of the casket is in a separate space. And my sister and I were really also moved by the way that the security staff takes real ownership of the space to make sure that it's treated as a place of respect. And I felt like that was really remarkable, right? How do you prepare people to respect the archive, right? I was also happy, of course, to see Professor David Driskell's painting, Behold Thy Son, in the Visual Arts Galleries. Through this work, he's able to create an archive of feeling. Something that I felt very impacted by, right? This feeling of loss and reverence that Professor Driskell brings to the work through his connection between the resurrection of Christ and the loss of Till, two people who didn't deserve to die, brings a weight and gravity to the tragedy, right? It gives you another opportunity to process that murder in that space. The idea of an archive of feeling is something that I think about also with Carrie James Marshall's Heirlooms and Accessories. And here Marshall reproduces the most famous lynching photograph of Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith from 1930 in Indiana. And so he reproduces the photograph 3 times, makes it translucent. I don't know how well you can see it in this slide, but trust me, that's what's there. And he's forcing us to focus on the elation and the pleasure of the murderers of Shipp and Smith. So he takes these women's faces and he puts them in lockets, right? A space reserved for loved ones. The remake of the photograph in the form of a triptych brings a certain kind of reverence to the work. And then there's also this focus on the happy women. Oh, thank you. Perfect, okay. The white women who were often responsible for the deaths of black men is highlighted here, right? So he's remaking this archival photograph in the way that helps us see the power dynamics in a different way and helps us see the image differently. So I'm near the end here, and I just needed to show this since we were talking about Emmett Till, where we are now. I wanted to look at this moment. These are 2 photographs of 2 paintings that are on view right now in New York in the Whitney for the Whitney Biennial. So on the left, we see the artist Parker Bright protesting the painting titled Open Casket from 2016 by a white woman named Dana Schutz. And on the right side, we see Henry Taylor, an African-American artist based in downtown LA. His work called The Killing of Philando Castile, The Times They Ain't Changing Fast Enough from this year. And so this discussion of protest and who's allowed to make what kind of art is something that I've been hearing about because I'm in the arts field, but I also heard about it on NPR. I also saw it on TV, so I was really surprised that this was really sort of breaking that immediate boundary of the art space. So questions here around the archive. How do we archive moments of protest in Black representation in art and in museums, right? I really like this photograph of someone photographing, the artist here, Parker Bright, who's trying to block the vision of Emmett Till, right, in this open casket piece. And so, yeah, we think about the kind of archives that we create ourselves because of technology and how easy it is to take photographs. But I think building an archive of African American resistance is always important, and that's what I mean by the everlasting now. The things that we're archiving today are things that will last beyond our lifetime. I wanted to just show a couple of more artists. Leslie Hewitt's Riffs on Real Time, her series made between 2002 and 2009. A conceptual artist who exhibits photographs of arrangements of objects, mostly works of Black literature and photographs. And so she creates these sculptures, I want to call them abstract sculptures, showing the kind of weights of meaning and significance of different bodies of literature and connecting them with photographs. And she shows them as photographs, not as sculpture. Here's another example of that, right? I mean, these are archival objects that she's arranging and photographing to create another archive of meaning, right? What they mean to her. My last 3 artists here, 4 artists. Adric Cowan's one of our honorees this weekend, right? We need to always think about the photographers who are creating the documents, who are creating that raw material that become archived. Adric Cowan has done this for decades, this fantastic photograph, Balloons of Ohio from 1956, right? Everyday Black people as well as celebrities. This is Garth Fagan, who is a choreographer based in Rochester, New York, and has a dance company there, right? Lifetime of images. And I also wanted to mention Whitfield Lovell, and he's in the same gallery with Rene Stout and Radcliffe Bailey at the museum. He combines attention to detail, right? Maintaining still a kind of simplicity in his work. It's really quite breathtaking, the way that he does these very simple but very detailed portraits of people, so that you really feel this reality effect that they're people that you know. And then often combining their images with objects. There's so much love in these pictures. I'm just going to show you a few of them. Still from 1999. Psalm 2. I mean, this is another artist who I think is so generous in the way that he's giving us so much feeling in the work. Bringer from 1999. And Destiny, right? It brings something to these archives of photographs and of objects, putting them together in such a way that there's a kind of meaning that becomes visible beyond just those objects alone. Titus Kafar, the Jerome project. This is an installation shot of the work in the Studer Museum in Harlem. So Titus Kafar, a young artist who has had a troubled relationship with his father, who was a minister but also a crack addict. And he is always making work about family and family relationships. He was looking up his father's name in Google to see if he could find his mugshot, and what he found were dozens and dozens of black men's mugshots with the exact same name. And he started to think, is there something about this name? You know, there's something about, thank you, this name that sort of connects you to prison. And, you know, of course, it's not that simple, but he was really fascinated by why this name was so popular. So what he did was he started to write letters to some of these men in prison and correspond with some of them. And then he started to make these really beautiful portraits of them. So making beautiful portraits from mugshots, right? There's this amazing transformation process there, and bringing these prisoners into a relationship where they're really individuals. And he deals abstractly and conceptually also by dipping the portraits into tar, right? So there's this blackness, there's this thickness and a kind of suffocation there, but then also sort of tenderly decorating them with gold leaf. There are many of these. In California right now, in LA, at the California African American Museum, and also at Jenkins Johnson Gallery in San Francisco, there's two really wonderful exhibitions of Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle's ink drawings. I'm showing you here her series of 100 missing black women called the Evanesced, women who have disappeared, and I mean disappeared as a verb here. They have been disappeared, taken, made to be missing. And she doesn't draw them to look like the women in a naturalistic and identifiable portrait, but she gives them character, spirit, a kind of individuality that gives another dimension to them, right? And these sort of quick drawings of them. It's a different way of seeing them than we may find on news programs and in television, a kind of new perspective. And so the last images I want to show you, I wanted to also mention Lorna Simpson, whose work has been so influential and profound for many of us. And she's someone else who's being honored this weekend, so I wanted to make sure to mention her as well. So she's made photographic-based artworks for decades that sort of haunt us with their obliqueness. She's allowed black figures to have a freedom that's been very challenging to the art world. It's been hard for the art world to really pin her down. And here in her work, 9 Props, she plays homage to the great prolific Harlem-based photographer James Van Der Zee. So I'll go back to this. So she was looking at his photographs and focusing on the detail of props and the objects in his work. And then she had actual objects custom made to represent the objects that we see in Van Der Zee's body of work. So she's created an archive of objects from Van der Zee. And she presents them in her own work with this kind of archival precision, right? Her signature black and white images, clean, clear lines, and almost scientific indexing shows us the archive that we have in the images made by Black artists. So I'll close here by saying the archive is alive and well in the tradition of art made by African American artists. It's also part of the innovations that African American artists are creating today. It's part of our future. I've only been able to share a handful of these artists with you today, but you know, and I know of so many more. And I look forward to hearing from the artists and archivists this weekend who will give us some more insight into their perspectives. So thank you.